What's up, guys? This is Phil Galfond for NL100.com. Today I'm going to be reviewing a session of some footage that was submitted by Run-At-Once member Robster. This is actually going to be part 2 for those of you who are newer at Run-At-Once and haven't gone back into the archives and watched previous videos. I made part 1 of this series 3-4 months ago, and unfortunately I do my best to jump back and forth between No Limit and PLO and 6max and Heads Up to try to appease everybody, but there are only so many videos to do that with, so we're not really able to, or I'm not really able to make, a 4-part series all in a row. At least I haven't figured out a good, fair way to do that just yet. We're picking up where we left off. I'm not going to get too much into previous reads because I want to fit as much content into this video as I can for our essential guys who get, one video from me each month. I want to make it count. As far as reads, we actually didn't develop a ton of reads on his 2 different opponents on these 2 tables of 50 cent $1 Heads Up No Limit. I pointed out some things in Robster's game. Specifically, there were some pre-flop leaks that I recall. Just playing a little bit too loose with some very trashy hands. Even against a min-raise, I think was going a little too loose. And we talked a little bit about choosing what hands to put in your c-bet range, and we'll see if those themes continue or what else happens. So I'll start the footage. We flopped a pretty nice hand on the right table. Yeah, I think calling here is standard. We have a showdownable hand with our queen high. We should really be turning weaker bluffs or, weaker semi-bluffs or strong draws with weak showdown value into bluffs here. I think with queen high and some ace high flush draws, we should be check calling. The reason I say some is that some of our ace high flush draws, especially ace 4, ace 5 with spades, we might want to turn into almost a value hand and check raise a relatively dry flop like this and try to see if we can get him to mess around or to float. Or to call and then bluff later when we hit our hand, something like that. And also to build a pot against weaker flush draws. Building a pot against weaker flush draws is something that could be worth considering with this hand, as most flush draws will be weaker than ours. This villain is opening most buttons. But I think all in all, it's best not to build too big a pot, because the hands that he will want to build an even bigger pot with are going to be the ones that are doing very well against our hand, or pretty well. So I'd rather not give him the option to do that and turn a hand like this that has a lot of equity and a lot of showdown value into a bluff that's essentially only bluffing his hands that we're already beating. Gets checked through on the turn. We hit our 8, and we have to think, at least on the turn, we have to be very confident that our 8 is good. I mean, if not, good for him. He's probably making a mistake by checking back a hand better than queen 8 on the turn. So let's not worry so much about that. A 6 offsuit river completes one of the potential draws we could have had, 5-4. It also pairs us if we had 6-5 or 6-4. However, he might have expected us to check raise those hands. So it's not doing much for us. I think it's pretty easy value bet here. We don't have a hand strong enough to check raise. It's not a situation where he's going to try to represent very strong hands once he's checked back the turn, so I don't view this as a great spot to try to induce a bluff. So I think it's a very clear value bet spot. I do think we're going to have a little bit of trouble getting looked up. I don't know whether or not this player is c-betting a 3 or a deuce in a spot like this, and we also don't know if he'll even call with those hands when we do bet, because the only draw that missed is the flush draw, and we haven't really developed a dynamic where we are check calling with, queen 9 offsuit to try to bluff later, or jack 10 offsuit to try to bluff later. So I don't think he'll expect many floats, but still, I think pretty easy value bet, as I just don't see any other play, namely checking, working out better for us. 8-6 offsuit on the left is fine defend in my opinion. I think it's kind of a fringe hand. I wouldn't mind 3-betting it as an offsuit connector, but it is really going to depend on my opponent. And this guy's folding to 40% of 3-bets, it looks like, if I'm reading Robster's HUD correctly. And so I would shy away. It's a small sample, but I would still shy away from 3-betting against somebody who's over a small sample, continuing the 60% of his range. So we flop a little something on the left table. Unfortunately, on the right table, our opponent folds, it looks like. So our gutter, undercards, not a very strong hand. This is a board that will bring very few made hands and a lot of draws. Flush draws, many, many gutters, the open-ender. And as far as made hands, given that he would expect us to 3-bet any overpairs, really hands that can check raise, at least, are going to be 7x for the most part. I think that even 7x and 7-7, which actually technically is 7x. Even a hand like Jack 10, I don't know if he'd expect us to raise. I personally would not raise Jack 10 here, although as I'm talking, I think maybe I'll need to if I want to have a semi-bluffing range here. But the issue is, if we don't raise Jack 10 for value, and we 3-bet with Ace 10, at least some of the time, we 3-bet with 10s, we 3-bet with Jacks plus, we don't have many value hands here. And while I think it's okay to rep a thin value range with a lot of semi-bluffs included, rep a small value range is actually what I meant as part of my overall range, which would also include some semi-bluffs. I think that's what you're supposed to do. I think you have to be very careful about getting carried away here, just because of how many draws are present and how few made hands are possible on this board. So if we think about the way we want to structure our overall range, let me pause right here and say there's a lot of importance in planning for your range, and the more you practice heads up no limit or 6-max no limit, whichever form you play the most, you'll get more used to building your ranges if you choose to approach poker this way. The reason I wanted to pause, though, is because it's not necessary, especially at smaller stakes and especially against players who are not going to be super tough. It's not really necessary that you balance your range, or at least go through this much effort to balance your range. But for those of you who are interested in it, I think it's worth talking about. And certainly against tougher opponents, you will want to be balanced, or at least achieve perceived balance in a lot of spots, and looking at ways to understand, actual balance is, I think, important. And while I'm not going to pause this video and get out a pen and paper and a calculator, or the laptop equivalent of that, and narrow down our range so precisely, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I want to play our hands, and without further ado, let's do that. So we're going to be check raising our 7s. Let's say most of our 7s, maybe 80%, 90%. Maybe Ace 10, but I actually think Ace 10 is not a good check raise here. At least, yeah, because on many board runouts, I don't want to be check raising betting turn and betting river with Ace 10. Oftentimes a straight or a flush will come in. We could run into a 7 or an overpair, to the point where by the time we're value betting the river, if he's playing properly and folding enough, we're maybe even value cutting ourselves on the river against his overall range. So if we're just check raising a 7, it's not going to be too many combos. We're going to have a lot of draws. So 8-6 is going to be one of our lowest showdown value draws, which would argue for it being in the check raise range, if we believe it's worth continuing with, at least. I think king high, ace high flush draws should probably be in the check call range. Queen high flush draws as well, maybe jack high flush draws as well. They have a little bit of showdown value, even as low as jack high has a little bit of showdown value, and the added overcard gives you more equity depending on your other card. Well, your other card can help too if you have a gutter, but gives you more equity against a 10, so that you can more easily call twice on certain cards, especially if you turn a gutter with your jack 5 of hearts, let's say an 8 of clubs. So I want to check call with those. I think some of my combo draws I actually might want to check call with, even a hand like, well, yeah, jack 9 suited, jack 8 suited, just because I can call enough turns with them. 8-6 offsuit, 8-6 of hearts, 9-6 of hearts, 8-9 of hearts. 8-9 can call a lot of turns, but perhaps we want to take those and put those in our bluffing range. We do need a bluffing range. So let's say we're making our bluffing range up of 9 high flush draws and lower. Unfortunately, that I'm not doing any kind of exact math right now, but in my head it seems as though that's going to cover a decent amount of combos. Some of which we did 3-bet, but same with 7x hands. That should take out a decent chunk of combos, and then I guess adding 8-6 offsuit, 8-9 offsuit maybe, and 9-6 offsuit would not be a total disaster. Although the offsuit combinations will increase our frequency, just because there are many more offsuit hands than suited hands. So I don't mind having this in my check raise range. The issues with the range I just gave is that if we tell somebody that range, they can know when we check call that we have fewer of the straight hands and many, many more flush draws. And so if we were building our actual range, we'd want to give some kind of frequencies to each of these hands and have a hand like 8-6 offsuit, perhaps check raise 85% and check call 15%, if we deem it not foldable. But I think that going with a check raise with this hand is probably the best way to play it, as I think it's too weak to check call. Just because on a board this draw heavy, you also have to remember that we get barreled so frequently, just because of how many draws he can have as well. And so a hand like this, even though we're check raising flop with very little equity, if we make it a small enough part of our range, I think we should be okay and kind of covered by the rest of our range. Although I suspect we might have to. Almost fold some hands like this. But again, I mean, if you really want to do an extensive analysis, which I very much encourage everybody to do in this comment section, I'd be happy to jump in and talk with you guys about it. If somebody wants to put some numbers to the range that I gave, and I would not be shocked at all if they came back with, hey, your range is going to be far too draw heavy, or hey, your range is going to be too heavy in like the offsuit combos, the offsuit weak draws. And I also wouldn't be shocked if they say, you have enough sevens to cover it, or more than enough sevens. And remember that, not remember because I didn't say it yet, but in a situation like this, we're talking about the flop again, ignore the king turn for now. In a situation like this, where you're going to have a check raise range that is going to occasionally give up on turns and rivers, but often barrel turns and rivers, and you can reduce your bluffing frequency on each street, what's going to happen is you can have, especially when you have bluffs with equity, you can have far more bluffs on the flop than value hands, and reduce them as the streets play out. Take some of those bluffs and give up with them, continue with some other bluffs and with your sevens, and especially on cards that are good for your range, you can add in even more of your bluffs and continue. And so he does barrel on the turn, and we have to fold our 8-6 offsuit, which is fine. I want to back it up and look at this hand on the right table to see how we are two-barreling with no equity. So this hand, I wouldn't mind checking back Queen 2 and trying to get to showdown. I also don't mind betting. King 10x is a very good board for our range. Not that our range hits it extremely often, but his range hits it, I don't want to say less often, but he nails it less often because he's going to be 3-betting some of the hands that connect very well with this board. For example, ace, queen, ace, jack of spades, ace, king, some combos of king, queen, king, jack, king, 10. We don't know his exact frequencies. King, king, ace, ace, 10, 10. Those are all hands that are likely in his 3-bet range, or at least, mostly in his 3-bet range. So he's taken those out of his range. He can still have a lot of calling hands, though. He can have a lot of king x hands, a lot of 10x. We don't know exactly how he's going to play his offsuit broadways or suited broadways, so he can have some of those, or like a jack-9 of spades, things like that. And we do have a bunch of air. However, betting here, I think because he can't have very wide check raise range, he's going to have to fold a lot of his potential bluffs. So betting here is going to work out okay. Checking is also a decent option. This is certainly, if on this board you want to be checking some hands to get them to showdown, Queen Deuce is a pretty decent candidate. Ace X would be a little bit better perhaps, or 5X, but we do have no pair, no draw here, and very, very few barrel cards on the turn that are good for us, almost no barrel cards perhaps that are good for us. I guess a Jack is pretty good for us, an Ace is pretty good for us, and really that's about it. So I'd maybe pick a different hand to c-bet, maybe with the Queen of Spades be more likely to c-bet, so that you can barrel a spade turn as well. But yeah, I think betting is okay, especially in a vacuum. I strongly dislike betting this turn. I think when we're thinking about our overall range, especially on a board like this, that we're going to be c-betting the flop quite a bit because the high card, I don't know, strength, texture of the flop. And then on this turn, if we were betting the flop with 6-7 offsuit, Ace-4, 6-4, etc., we picked up some more outs with those hands, 7-4, things like that. And obviously the flop already contained a couple of draws with the straight draw and the flush draw. So we are going to have plenty of hands with worse showdown value than this to barrel with, and worse showdown value, and more importantly than that, more equity. Because if we continue to barrel or add hands like this into our barreling range with very little equity, it's going to make calling much, much more attractive for him with his bluff catchers, to the point where we're being exploited when he calls. If we have enough value hands and then a bunch of draws, as long as the draws have decent equity, we can actually do fairly well by betting all of them and discourage him from calling with some of his marginal bluff catchers. So I pretty strongly dislike this turn barrel. Flop is kind of whatever. I think standard would be to check the flop, but I think in a vacuum it's fine. I don't love betting this river. I mean, it's not terrible, especially if he has some reads, but the only great reason is the queen blocker, and that's barely a reason because he's not going to play queen jack this way always, and that's really the one hand that our blocker matters against. He can have a ton of king x hands that he wouldn't check raise at any point. He can also have 10x hands that probably aren't folding now, so I think we're really trying to fold out his ace high and 5x hands with this river barrel, and with the low straight draw missing and the flush draw missing, I think we have far better hands to bet the turn with, and then better hands to bet the river with. So we do get the fold there, and if you are having a lot of success with plays like that in these games, then I would view that as an exploitative adjustment to players under defending in certain spots. But as far as kind of technically and game theory based play goes, that was not a hand to be doing that with. And let me know what you think about. I think I've shied away from getting as focused on balancing game theory in some of the lower stakes essential videos because it is less important. But I think that a good understanding of it can still help and is not necessarily, a waste of information or a waste of time to get more, exploitative tricks into your game plan. Check call on the left table with queen 3. I think it's very standard. You could argue that it's not a good call in the big blind. I think that, I'm not a heads up no limit specialist nowadays, so I am not entirely sure, but I'd be interested for some of our heads up no limit guys to chime in on that. I think that if it is not a call, it's a pretty good candidate to 3-bet. Even though, like I said, this guy seems to be not folding to a ton of 3-bets, it still works pretty well. You have one blocker to ace queen, king queen, queen queen, Queen 10, Queen Jack, some suited broadways, things like that. So it helps in that respect. You also have a queen, which can flop top pair. But obviously, it's not a great hand. It's clearly a bluff. On the right table, we check-folded Queen 10 offsuit on this board, which is okay. Against somebody who doesn't bet king high, you're actually doing decently with that hand. However, it's going to be tough to defend on many turns. So perhaps check folding is best. It's not a hand I'd want to be check raising with because it has so few outs against a lot of his bet call range, which, will mostly be ace-x. So we're in an interesting situation here on the left table where after check calling a flop with no draws present other than the gut shot, two draws come in, the backdoor flush draw and the flopped straight draw. And so it's basically impossible for us to have air in this spot. In some spots, you could say it's impossible, but maybe you have ace high, which has showdown value, but we can't have ace high because ace high is top pair now. So I think this is almost the absolute bottom of our range, and I think it's an excellent spot to bluff. And if we get looked up here by, let's say, a jack, I think our opponent is most likely making a mistake against our range. Again, I am kind of making some off the top of my head comments in situations like this, so perhaps it wouldn't be a very big mistake to call us down with a jack, or at least with certain blockers, but I think that it's definitely a great play, and I'm glad to see Robster making it. I'm starting to wonder if the best way to appease everybody in Essential is if I made 2 videos each month that were half the length, one no limit, one PLO. Popped into my head, so I said it. So let me know what you think. On the left table, we check raise with King Jack offsuit on 3-4-5 with 2 clubs. I don't love this. I think we have a hand we can actually check call with, although it's thin, but we have the backdoor flush draw as well as high card strength, showdown value, and 2 overcards. The problem is, with the exception of, my first instinct was that we don't hit this board super often just because we're going to fold some of the combos here, like 5-3 offsuit and 4-3 offsuit, but we've seen in part 1 of this, we saw Robster calling with basically everything, including a few instances of 4 deuce offsuit. So I guess that doesn't apply anymore. So we do have plenty of hands that fall into that category. We're going to want to check call with our ace-x hands here. Most likely, we're going to check raise our 6s, unless they have some showdown value with them. Some low, weak showdown value, flush draws. I don't know. I don't think this is a great hand to do it with, but I think it's okay. We can probably, if we get kind of a dream run out, if we turn a king and then get, the perfect brick river, I guess, an offsuit 10, then we do have, I think, a confident value bet. Not confident, but I think it is definitely a value bet. So there are more outs than just the backdoor stuff. Once he calls, we're in an interesting spot because we now have no outs other than our 2 overcards. There's a small chance we have the best hand, but that's not too relevant. When he bet calls the flop, see, we need to get an idea. It looks like if this stat is c-bet flop, then he's c-betting 100%, which would mean that some of his bet calling range is, if that's true, would be 3x and 4x, whereas some people would only bet stronger and weaker hands than that, in which case when they do bet call, we have to be a lot more worried. So because of that, I wouldn't mind barreling, and probably barreling off on a lot of bricks. Even though we'll have a lot of missed draws in those instances, he also will have a lot of maybe ace-6 or 6-3 hands like that, 5 deuce. So while he can certainly hero call with them, I think it's fine to barrel off here, although, again, this is probably not the hand we want in our check raising range. On the right table, we're just going to bet after this get checked through on all streets. I think that's fine. I can't really argue with it from any perspective, really. We face a bet on the left table, and we do have to check fold our king high, but I don't really mind that line. Get 3-bet on the left table, very easy call. And an easy open on the right table. So faced with a c-bet on king 5 deuce, this is a board that is better for him than us. Quite clearly, I think he would expect us to fold a lot of our, weak 5 and deuce x hands to his 3-bet. And, he hits the king. He's repping hands that hit the king, at least, more than we are. So I do think he's going to be c-betting a lot, or should be c-betting a lot. I'm sure he also will be, since he seems to c-bet every hand. But I think we have a hand we can call with. Again, if we want to talk more about our range, this is actually doing fairly well in our range. I mean, it's not tip-top. Certainly we can have some sets. We can have king x. But other than that, and we can have some actual flush draws. But we have a backdoor flush draw. We have ace high, which is some showdown value. And, we're facing a bet of $8 into $13.50. So we have some decent pot odds as well as position. There are some cards that can roll off, like the 4 or the 3, where we can turn our hand into a bluff or a semi-bluff on the turn, especially if we pick up a heart. Otherwise, we can just try to get to showdown with this hand, perhaps on a spade as well. We c-bet on the right table. I think it's okay, but we're not going to get great results with this play. If we check back, I think we can very easy call 2 barrels, and even sometimes catch him value cutting himself. We can also 2-barrel once we check back on certain turn cards and river cards. When we bet here, we're kind of eliminating a lot of the worst hands. He'll check call with some 7x hands, but he'll call mostly with jack x, I guess some 10x hands as well. But then he'll also check raise with 8-9, with 2-pair, and with some of his weaker draws. And so we turn a hand that is pretty good into a pure bluff catcher against his check raise range, which isn't necessarily a problem overall, except that I don't see us getting a ton of value by against his check calling range. And by a ton, I mean there's certainly some, but yeah, I think checking back is the play I'd prefer. I'm cool with the turn barrel on the right table for value, but presumably we're going to check back the river. It's for value and it's for protection since this board is so draw heavy. I actually like the turn bet more than the flop bet. So yeah, I think it's the right play on the turn. On the left table, we face another bet on the 6 of spades, which is interesting because it's not the best card for his range, but we have ace high with no draw at this point, so I think it's a pretty easy fold. Four-eight suited is a good calling hand and decent 3-betting hand as well. We choose to call, and we flop a flush draw. On the right table, we get our fold, which is fine. I mean, we certainly have the best hand if he's folding that turn, but he very likely had reasonable equity, at least. 8-9 suited is also a sometimes 3-bet, sometimes call hand for me, personally. We check call on the left. It's another one of those situations where we don't have a very wide value range. However, 8-4 suited might be the kind of hand that we want to put in our check raise range. I think probably is. And it does play out fine as a check call, and then, turn into a bluff later. And some players, I think, will develop a strategy where they check call pretty much all of their continuing range on this board, and then check raise turns, or potentially just bet rivers when it gets checked through, or call turns and check raise rivers with certain hands like this when they miss. I think that's fine, but I personally would have a flop check raising range consisting of most of my 5s and then some of my weaker draws like this, and very occasionally some backdoor draw type hands, 6-7 of spades, jack 10 of spades, things like that. But we do opt to check call, which is fine. And again, it could be the case that if we check raise all of our flush draws or all of our weak flush draws, we are unbalanced. Given this board run out, we have a pretty easy check, in my opinion. I don't think he has many queens, but if he does, I don't think he's folding. I don't think he's folding any aces, and I don't think he's calling with worse than an 8 almost ever, perhaps like a king high. But it's pretty rare, so I think we just have a clear showdownable hand and potential bluff catcher. On the right table, well, now we hit our flush, so it's less interesting, but 7-5 of hearts is a pretty good 3-barrel hand in this spot. It has pretty decent equity, and it also, well, a few things about it. First of all, it has decent equity. Second of all, it has no showdown value. Third of all, this is the kind of board that we hit pretty well, at least better than them. It's also the kind of board where some of their hands, like Jack-9, are going to call twice and fold river because they missed the straight draws. However, this is actually nice because when we do turn, in addition to being able to barrel on bricks, I think we can also successfully barrel on those straightening turns and rivers, especially a brick turn and a straightening river. Well, not especially. Yeah, especially. I guess we can do it on the turn as well, but if he calls the turn, I expect his range to be a little stronger on let's say, a 10 than on a 4. So I think we'll have more river success if it goes 4-10 than if it goes 10-4. But anyways, pretty good to barrel in both spots, and yes, sometimes when the 10 rolls off or the jack rolls off, he'll hit some straights or some 2-pair hands, but overall I think you'll make him fold enough Queen X hands and perhaps King X hands on those boards that you're doing pretty well. And then obviously on the flush turns and rivers, we have a made hand and we're going to value bet. Interesting to note that our opponent checked back Queen 7 on the left table. I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's a fine play. I believe he felt that, he didn't want to bet twice for value, so checking back and betting river perhaps was good, or he felt that, he'd get check raised on the turn sometimes, so checking back and inducing a bluff from the hands, and I mean, like we see here from Robster, the check call with 8-4 of hearts. Had Robster missed, we would have seen a bluff, and he would have picked us off with a queen. So I think well played by everybody. So now we'll just barrel through on the right table. And left table, we open King 4 offsuit. We check the 10-9 deuce board. Definitely the right play to check this back, in my opinion. It's a very wet board, so we should expect a lot of action from his range. And wet high card boards actually give you less action than these wet middling cards, and especially lower card boards where people have a lot more incentive to play with their overcards. In a situation, make this board, ace-king deuce or king-queen deuce, and it actually becomes a better c-bet, not because we have a king in our hand, but a more c-bettable board. But in situations like this, where people have a gutter and an overcard, or a gutter and 2 overcards, I mean, they're not going anywhere. Or even, like a high card, backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw with an overcard. So I think it's a very poor board to c-bet. Definitely want to try to take king high to showdown, and I think probably fold to any action, and not be too worried about getting exploited doing that, because we'll have some check back hands that we can continue with. Easy value bet on the river here. The jack's not an ideal river, but I still think we're very clearly strong enough to value bet, and we unfortunately get a fold, but, well, I guess not super unfortunately. There could have been worse results. Jack 3 offsuit, we folded on the right table to a min raise, which I think is fine. Like the Queen 3 that I talked about earlier, it's a decent option for a 3-bet bluff hand, but I'd have to look at frequencies to see if you're 3-betting all of those, how many bluffs it adds to your range. Alright, so Queen Jack on the left table, Jack 7 on the right table. We are very likely to have the best hand on both tables. I think after checking back the flop on the right table, which is pretty good, I wouldn't mind c-betting this because we do have a lot of turns we can barrel, but I also don't mind checking it back. It has a little bit of showdown value and can continue on some of those turns, potentially even raising. Now on this turn, if it's checked to us, we should bet twice for value, and if he bets, we should call twice, essentially. It's kind of a simple hand at this point. check on the flop on the left table. The King of Hearts turn makes our decision a little bit more interesting. On, let's say, a 4 or a 3, we have a pretty easy bet for value. I don't really like any other line better than that. On the king, however, if we think he's checking back some air hands, or at least a decent amount of air hands to delay c-bet, he's always going to c-bet on this turn, and potentially 2-barrel, with almost no equity against our hands. So if we can take, if we give him 10 deuce offsuit and get him with that hand to bet twice, if he did check back, he almost surely would bet the turn and perhaps bet the river, because by check calling we might look like an 8 or a 5. That would be a big win for us, rather than betting and having him just fold his 10 deuce or his 10-6 or 9-4 or whatever, or even, queen high. However, he has c-bet every hand so far, if I'm reading this stat correctly, and I've noticed him c-betting a lot. So I actually think he's very likely to have some showdown value when he checks back, like a 5 or an 8. So I think I would just bet twice here and not really think twice about it. I definitely understand the check from Robster, and like I said, against certain opponents, I would love that play. But also this $2 bet is congruous with my theory that he's checking back some kind of showdownable hand. Let's say he checked back an 8, and now he's betting small on the turn just to protect his hand and take it to showdown cheaply. And then I would suspect him to check back the river. Still, though, even if I felt very strongly about that read, I wouldn't feel strongly enough to check raise the turn for value and bet the river for value. You would need at least a weak king, in my opinion, to do that, because of the risk of just running into a better hand. Now he bets the river, and that basically kills my theory that he was checking down just a showdown hand. He could potentially have a hand like ours, Jack 10, Jack 7, Jack 4, something like that. So I definitely would call here. We're very high up in our check call. We're near the top of our range for check calling the turn after the flop gets checked through in this spot. So in theory, we need to be calling here. In addition, I think he can have some worse value hands, at least a couple of them. Jack X, perhaps even Ace 8 if he's a tough player, and really just doesn't think we have anything better than an 8. But my theory that he had like a 5 or an 8 is probably off, which happens. Oh no, okay, so he did have an 8, and he went for the thin river value bet. So pat myself on the back. And that's actually a good point to wrap the video up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know that I talked at length over some hands, but I do think, in the past I've sped through hands or done some live Zoom videos and talked more about exploitative play and how to adjust to your opponents and things like that. And I think you essential guys were missing, at least for me, some more theoretical talk and range building and things like that. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I definitely will be in the comment section to answer any questions and follow up on this. So please jump in, and if you guys want to contribute and do some range breakdown and go from there and see what we think about specific ranges and specific spots, I'll jump in there and help you guys build them. So yeah, thanks for watching. I will see you next month. This is Phil Galfond from RunOnce.com. Take care, guys.